Welcome to Unapologetically Sensitive, where you can learn, relate, laugh, and maybe even live a bolder, brighter life. I'm your host, Patricia Young. This is a weekly podcast where we explore the strengths we have because of our sensitivity and some of the challenges it poses as well. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hey there. To the creatives, healers, sensitives, and deep thinkers, how the heck are ya? We are mid-December now, so how's it going? How are you doing with the holidays? Do you celebrate the holidays? Do you need to stop and rest? Are you overstimulated? Are you overwhelmed? Are you taking care of yourself? Today's episode with Jen, I really enjoy it. We kind of start with a question of, somebody in one of my groups asked something to the effect of, is it hard to be in a relationship with an HSP? And Jen and I really take a look at this and talk about what our thoughts are about that. And I think many HSPs have been told that it's difficult to be in relationship with them. And I think it's about so much more than that. And if you just take an HSP that has no wounding, I don't think there's any issue at all. There's so many more factors that are involved, but I don't want to give a spoiler about it. But we talk about differential susceptibility, who is likely to get anxiety and depression if they're an HSP, HSPs that prefer not to be in relationships, things that you need in a relationship, that attunement, and how we need to have positive voices that we internalize, that sense of self-compassion, how miscommunication, misunderstanding, misperceptions, imperfection, being able to understand other people's perspective can come into play in relationships, wanting to have safety and understanding in a relationship, that existential loneliness or feeling like there's something wrong with you, feeling othered. I don't know. I just think there's a lot of really good stuff in here. So I think you're going to enjoy it. I think that's all I'm going to say. And now, on to the show. Hey, Jen, how are you?
Hi, Patricia. I'm good today. How are you?
I'm good. I was supposed to paddle and I was really excited. I'm usually not excited, and it rained and my boat's still sitting on the car and we have to take it off, put it back to bed. I'm sad, but I'm okay.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Stupid rain.
I know. And then the rain contaminates the water, so sometimes I can't paddle for a few days because the runoff. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. So in one of my groups, the online HSP course, somebody asked, is it hard for people to be in relationships with HSPs? And you and I have been talking about friendships. I think a lot of HSPs have wounding in friendships. I think friendships in general can be challenging. I think we have seasons for friendships. We can have high expectations. There's attachment wounding. So I thought it might be interesting to just throw this out today and talk about it. What do you think?
I say we give it a try. I am going to chuckle, though, about this if I don't say it about the whole before we got on. So hopefully this is okay with you.
Of course it is.
But I was mentioning that it's going to happen one day, that we're going to sit down, we're going to hit record, and we're going to be like, blah, can't use that one. And so I said, well, maybe today will be the day.
Mm-hmm. And I said, I don't accept that.
So I am curious if we're going to get to the end of this and be like, yeah, cool. That's like we usually do. I mean, I think we have a pretty good experience at doing this where, we do these pretty blind. Like we don't come in with, it's like, what topic? Oh, let's do friendship today. Yeah. And I love that.
I have had a few episodes that I have not aired because the interviews were not good. And there have been interviews that I didn't think were very good that end up being really popular. So I really try and just trust and let it go unless there's something about the interview that really just doesn't feel okay with me. But I think we've got this. And I don't accept that it's not going to work.
I love this, though, because in me, I'm like, it's inevitable. Mm-hmm. It is going to happen. And I will not be upset when it happens.
I'll be disappointed when it happens and I'll have to deal with my expectations.
Oh my gosh, that's going to be a fun episode.
It's all fodder to talk about.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts? Do you think that it's harder for HSPs to be in relationships or for people to be in relationships with HSPs?
Before I answer that question, I really want to separate out that it's not, I don't believe that it's HSP inherently, being a highly sensitive person inherently. I think that as we move through life, we get these layers, right, of experience that happen to us. And without really sensitive and tuned in parenting, right? This is where they compare HS children to like orchids versus dandelions.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody can benefit from really good parenting. And then HSPs seem to do far worse with sort of not quite as sensitive parenting. And unfortunately, a lot of our conventional parenting wisdom falls in that bucket.
Mm-hmm.
The parents that I work with that are trying to be that parent to their children often feel a lot of societal pressure. You know, they get blamed for like what's, you know, normal, developmentally appropriate behavior that the rest of the parenting ethos seems to want to squash down.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's that. So as we're having this conversation, are HSPs difficult to be in relationship with, be in friendship with? I think that the difficulty isn't inherently about being an HSP. I think it's the difficulties happen because HSPs, as we process more and process it more deeply, tend to be invalidated, be gaslit, be, you know, early on, no, it's not that way, and tend to get wounded, quite
Mm-hmm.
frankly. And then it's those usually attachment wounds, whether they come from primary caregivers or teachers or someone in a caregiving role in pretty early childhood. And it seems like the earlier, if it happens worse earlier, the more difficult it can be, the more pre-verbal it is, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Difficult to get at. But I think it can happen at any point into childhood and even into adulthood, which, you know, I think adulthood's a myth anyway. But, well, first of all, you said that, and I was like, I should take a poll. Everybody, that would be interesting because that is one of the things that I've been healing lately, being convinced that I'm difficult to love
Mm-hmm.
and hard to be in relationship with, and wanting to make myself as small and as needless as
Mm-hmm.
possible. And I think I've had, at 49 years old, a nice breakthrough recently
Right.
with that, and with the love and support of friends like you, and which in many ways is a mirror for that like sensitive parenting, right? It's sensitive responding to each other.
Right. And those feelings of, am I lovable? Am I too much? Can people be in relationship with me? Those are not about being an HSP. That's about wounding.
Yes.
And if we look at the research around differential susceptibility, what it says is you put a highly sensitive person, say a child, in, this is where orchid theory comes in. Orchids thrive if you put them in the right temperature, with the right climate, with the right amount of water. That's how HSPs are. You put an HSP in a nurturing environment, that HSP is going to have better outcomes than a non-HSP. The opposite is true. You put them in a poor environment, and for a child, it can just be having a mismatch in temperament. And the parent or the caregiver doesn't understand the temperament of the HSP. So you don't have to have abuse. You don't have to have violence. It can just be that it's a mismatch. And those HSPs are going to have worse outcomes than the non-HSPs. This is where Dr. Aaron talks about higher rates of anxiety and depression when HSPs are in poor environments. And then you add attachment wounds onto that. And the other factor that I want to bring in is it's not about, are HSPs difficult to be in relationship with? You can have a very well-adjusted HSP, and you can have a non-HSP who maybe doesn't have the skills to be in a relationship. So I don't want to make this HSP, non-HSP, but I also want to elucidate that it's not just the HSPs, that there are a lot of people out there that don't have the skills that are equipped to be in a nurturing relationship. And given an HSP that's done their work, we are great in relationship because we are tuned in and we are receptive and we are self-reflective and we tend to own our stuff and we want to make things better. So I think, as a generalization, I think HSPs want fairness and peace and justice and connection for the most part. I don't know. What do you think? Correct me where you disagree.
I don't think I disagree anywhere. I mean, thank you for speaking more eloquently than I did about the orchid theory, right? And, it's really kind of boils down to in childhood and then in adult relationships, the reciprocity, right? Which we've talked about. I think an episode we just came out about that, right?
It's called Are You the Giver or the Givee? And it is episode 163.
Thank you. So in these reciprocal relationships, like who is accommodating the attachment? You know what I mean? And that, as a definition of reciprocity, and is that balanced?
And what does that mean when you say accommodating the attachment?
Well, this is hustling. Like who has to, so that the relationship can exist, right? Who and how much needs to stretch?
And what would that look like?
Oh, I'm not sure I can come up with an on the spot example that doesn't feel a little tender. Give me a second.
I can
Oh,
if you
good.
want.
Yeah.
I think it's that who's going to be flexible. And if you're hurting, am I available? Am I responsive? Do I want to show up to help you? Do I change my schedule to meet your needs? The reciprocity is we both do this, we both accommodate, but we have ways of not feeling adequate. And I think it's so common for HSPs that if our needs were not allowed and legitimate and we had parents that had needs, we figured out how to meet their needs. And we got a sense of connection through, oh, mom came in the door, she's upset. So I know that if I put my clothes away or I bring her a drink or whatever, if I can figure out what she needs to meet her need, she's going to want to connect with me and I'm valuable. And we get our sense of value through this hustling. And you and I talked about this recently, that I had this thing with Marco Polo of wanting to reflect very accurately and thoroughly. I think I was needing that too. But it got to a point where it felt exhausting to me. And I just want to show up. And it's funny as I'm practicing this with a few of the people that I use Marco Polo with, and they're not reflecting, like I feel like, oh, I don't have to do it. You don't have to either. And it just drops that standard. But 6 months ago, a year, that was really important to me. So we also have kind of developmental needs that we have in our relationships because most of us didn't get this stuff to start out with. And I think being seen, heard, and validated is really important. And they're natural skills that we have that we're good at. So it's not that we don't want to use them, but it's what's driving behind it. And 6 months ago, if you told me I was hustling in my relationship with you, I would have said, no, this is what I do. And it wasn't until I go like, ugh, this is so hard and I don't want to do it. And I'm like, oh, this isn't working.
Yeah. And you can tell when it's a wound, right? When you then lean into that and I'm like, don't do it. Just don't do it. I'm here. Like, it's cool if you're tired, right? Take a break. And then when it evoked some tender.
Oh my gosh, you're going to leave. I'm selfish. I can't do that. Yeah, I brought up all of this stuff. So if you're wondering if you're hustling, imagine what would happen if you stopped that behavior. What do you imagine would happen? I'm going to be left. I'm going to be abandoned. They're going to get mad at me.
Yeah. And that would be stop that behavior on one hand, or insist on that need to be met, right? Or really advocate for yourself. This is something I need in relationship. And if that feels scary to do, the too much story, right? You can,
Right.
it's funny. I do think that there's an aspect of doing counseling and therapy that's really energy work, and you have to follow the energy. And if that energy has that somewhat desperate kind of scurry, like, and a lot of tender, you can see it, like the tear. Well, I know for me, it's like often tears. I'm sure it can present many ways. It could be anger, it could be irritation, it could be freezing, right? Just kind of going into that sort of really tired, just pull, energetically. You can work with that. And that's kind of the sign, right? That there's in IFS, that would be in internal family systems, that would be, there's a young wounded part there that needs our love and attention and understanding. And then hopefully the love, attention, and understanding of our closest relationships. And here's the painful part, right? Like if that can't be allowed in there with curiosity and compassion about each other, and there's a disagreement or a fight, or we're not being intentional about understanding and instead take it personally or take it somewhere else, it can be damaging, right, to the connection. Because, how could it not be, right? Someone is now feeling not understood, not held, right? And sometimes for those of us with a lot of wounding, abandoned, like
Mm-hmm.
Oof, I was right. Like this person, even if they're not physically leaving, have left emotionally. And we can feel that.
Right. Right. The other thing that I see is people not wanting to really be in relationship or reluctant about friendships because their experience has been so unpleasant and damaging that it's not even worth trying. And I feel a lot of sadness around that. I see that frequently. And if you haven't had that experience of being seen and heard and validated and held and respected and nurtured, how would you know that that exists, especially if you've been hurt in relationships and that's what your lens is, that relationships are painful and it's not worth it and I don't get my needs met? That's a real tough one when I see that.
Yeah, I often see that with also combined with a layer of longing for that very
Hmm.
thing that we're so scared of. And it is.
Yeah.
That's really rough. And, I'm curious what your thoughts are about, like, what do we do to work with that, right? I know some of the things that I do, but, sort of like what's the way, not out of it, but through it.
Right. For me, sometimes it comes up in the HSP groups. Oftentimes it comes up in the work that I do with people. And we talk about corrective experiences. How would you know that you could have a connection and be seen and heard and have a place where you can disagree and have conflict if you've never had it before? And I often have clients use judgmental words about their behavior. And it's like, you learn that to keep you safe because it wasn't okay to have needs and wants and want that connection. And hopefully, a group, a relationship, therapy, coaching, if you have someone that's skilled with attachment issues, you recreate that safety in that relationship and you get a chance to practice so you know it's possible. And then you learn to internalize some of those comforting, reassuring things, and you can take that and practice in other relationships. We've talked about, you and I have an episode that just came out called Wounding Happens in Relationships and So Does Healing. I think wounding and healing happens in relationships, where we're talking about me not reflecting and what it brought up for me. This is how we heal. But it has to be with someone who can hold space for us and is doing their own work so that we can get that reciprocity.
And just to be super clear, like this can be with a non-HSP person,
Mm-hmm.
right? Absolutely. Where's the overlap, right? It's in being aware, doing the work. And yeah, it's funny, words carry such connotations, but, certainly a non-HSP can be sensitive to things.
Mm-hmm.
We use that term to describe very specifically like a nervous system that sort of
Right.
operates in a certain way, right? But non-HSPs can, if they're sensitive to that, if they are educated about these things and really, want to understand, absolutely
Absolutely.
they can.
I've done so much attachment healing with my husband. I mean, I came in so wounded, and we've been married for 25 years now. And he's not an HSP. He has areas where he's sensitive and other areas where it's not that he's insensitive. He just doesn't have the vocabulary and is not dialed in, and it has that awareness that I have. So, yes, it's absolutely possible to do healing with someone who's not an HSP.
Yeah, and of course, these things are on a continuum, right? And then it's
Hmm.
also layered in with other aspects of the individual. How curious are they? Are they psychologically sophisticated or at least curious, right? Or interested?
Hmm.
Because that's a lot of what we're talking about. It was funny as you were talking, I was thinking back to those series of polos, the ones that you were referencing just a minute ago.
Hmm.
And I'd be so curious what this might have been like if we were not asynchronistic with the Marco Polo.
Hmm.
But if you remember, like you had a pretty big emotional, I don't know what to call it, event occurrence arising, right? I mean, that's what they do.
Reaction.
They just
Yeah.
like come
Yeah.
out, right? And we can't control them. They really can be very surprising. And then I had one.
Hmm. Hmm.
So there's this idea about having to make a lot of space, for both people in the relationship to have big feelings. And this is where I love to go into adulthood really is a myth. You don't hit a certain age and then suddenly not have feelings. You may have gotten more skilled at stuffing them somewhere or focusing so much on something else so that you don't feel any of that stuff. but there's probably something. I mean, everything has pros and cons, right? So I'm curious about the cons that might need to be mitigated from some of those approaches, including not having access to a lot of the beauty of our emotions and the way we get drawn in together through emotions, and how emotional resonance is so rich and connective.
What are your thoughts about when you have clients that want that connection, but they really struggle, or they feel like they can't be in relationship, or have had so much wounding that it just, the thought of opening up to someone is like,
Yeah, I mean, it's a slow process, I think. Fostering self-compassion is really important so that as you have experiences, you have a soft place to land,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because it is scary. And to know that you've got resources. Sometimes with clients, I will do what I call like a witnessed journal, where when they're having
Mm-hmm.
those moments, they may write me an email, and they have to make it really clear if they need a response, because often it's just, I will read it, we'll discuss it at next session.
Mm-hmm.
And it provides, much like our Marco Polos do, like a space to know that it's being witnessed, it's being held with compassion, and some of that compassion is contagious. And clients will
Mm-hmm.
reflect, like they can almost, imagine what the perspectives that maybe I would bring that are more compassionate, that,
Right.
then so that is a very important, almost like a safety feature. Like in a car,
Right.
if there had a safety feature, like I think that's because it's hard work. It's hard
It
work.
is. It is. And internalizing those gentle, compassionate voices. So many of us don't have that. And we've got the negative stream that just runs constantly. And I always use this example of, like, if a little child spills milk, that the parent can either yell at them and the child becomes fearful, or the parent goes like, oh, let's get out the paper towels or the towels and let's clean this up. And do we need to look at where the glass was? Was it too close to the edge of the table? And, here's what we do. And then the next time the milk spills, the child can go like, okay, what do we do? Oh, we need to go get the towels and we need to wrap it up. Do I need to look at where the glass was? That when children are raised with that compassion, that compassionate educational voice, it's safe, they internalize that so they can kind of reparent and do that corrective work on their own. I'm not saying that we don't do it, not in relationships, but oftentimes what happens is we don't get that. And so a relationship with a therapist or a coach, you start internalizing. And how many times have I repeated something I've heard you say, or somebody tells me that they've internalized my voice? What would Patricia say? What would my therapist say? That's part of how we get that corrective experience, so that we have that compassionate voice and guide when we're struggling.
Yes. Yeah. In IFS terms, that would be self energy,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which the thought being that as the counselor, as the space holder, you're kind of like a tuning fork. So when
Mm-hmm.
your self energy kind of can hopefully resonate and draw out the client's own source of healing. So it's like these layers of relationships, right? There's the relationship internally. This is the self compassion, right? The inner relationships, the voices that are critical or cruel, or that echo old stories that you've learned your whole life, right? Or whatever. And they just sort of perpetuate. Then there's the relationship with the therapist. And then there's taking sort of what's theory and story and moving it into experience, hopefully with enough curiosity and like you're on a quest.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like concentric circles of safety, understanding. I find, so another piece is really getting into or addressing some of the perfectionism, right? Or all or nothing kind of thinking. I mean, often those stories or those parts become kind of rigid.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think with the rigidity, there are two things that happen. Because I was thinking earlier about, if I could go back and talk to myself about previous relationships. I think there are seasons for relationships. Sometimes relationships are meant to come and go. I think often, as people that are assigned female as birth, we tend to think that relationships should be permanent. And when they don't last for forever, we feel like we failed or we've done something wrong. And I know that my rigidity, I lost a number of relationships. I think that sense of justice and fairness and what feels right when we haven't done our work, that we can draw a very hard line in the sand. And I wish that I would have just given a little bit more room to just create a little bit more space in the relationship. And then when I softened and did more of my healing, maybe we could have come back to the relationship. Maybe not. I think also when you do a lot of your own work, that what you want in relationships changes, and you may outgrow your relationships as well. But knowing that we can have all of those things, I think, is important. But that wounding and that rigidity, I think, can make it challenging in relationships because of that all or nothing.
Yes. Yeah.
I think the other thing, and I keep losing this thought, it's a thread, that people often go, I can't trust in relationships. And because we tend to feel connected, and if you have trauma, you may be an oversharer. I think as HSPs, we can connect with people, but we often give too much too fast, and then it doesn't work. And then we get angry and we say we can't trust people. And I think that it takes time to develop trust in a relationship, and you practice with, I know you and I have very different language around this. So when I'm done, share what your language is, but we practice little amounts of trust that aren't going to devastate us, to see if I tell you that hurt my feelings, are you able to hear me? Are you going to respond compassionately? Or are you going to get angry with me? I'm going to try little things at a time to see what happens in the relationship and what the strength of the relationship is. And can the relationship handle conflict? And do you get angry and defensive, or can you hear what I'm saying? So we build that slowly. But I think people tend to overshare, expect too much. They don't get it. They get hurt and they go like, that's it. I'm out of here. This is what always happens.
Yeah. It's funny. Like, there's so many skills that are needed here. The ability to be curious.
Mm-hmm.
The ability to tolerate disappointment, imperfection, misunderstanding,
Mm-hmm.
imperfection in ourselves and others, in the imperfection in just the relationship itself, which is kind of this other entity, and the ability to take perspective. And I think our lack of ability to take perspective,
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the healthiest things I did for my own self, and some of this comes from, I think, is informed by my ACT background, right? Acceptance and commitment therapy. It's really connected to something called a relational frame theory. And it really gets into this double-edged sword of language and how much, language has this kind of dark side to it. And
Mm-hmm.
so the healthy thing that I did for myself is flipped. Like, instead of getting upset that someone wasn't understanding, I solidly take the stance that misunderstanding is the norm. And the fact that anyone can understand each other using these little symbols, in my mouth right now, they happen to be English, right? And they can be a variety of languages. It's just symbolic. It's called something in different languages, but it's not like this physical thing I'm holding in my hand right now, a glass. I'm going to call it that. But
Mm-hmm.
it's rather relatively simple, but sometimes also not easy with physical objects. But now we're also talking about things like concepts, emotions,
Mm-hmm.
the way something lands within a rich personal historical context, and then a broader historical context. To me, it's like a miracle any of us can communicate at all and really understand each other. I think this is the flip side of that for me, is like being really in touch with that existential loneliness, because I'm in this little bubble here, and it often doesn't feel like there's anybody in here with me. And those beautiful moments of connection, it's like, oh, our bubbles just pop together and we're actually sitting in the same bubble. And we're going to lose that because it's kind of an expansion and contraction thing. But maybe we can regain it in those beautiful moments of connection. And then it's natural that they kind of go back to being apart, and the hard work. How often do we assume, well, you just don't understand, not realizing that it takes work to have those different perspectives. And I mean, even in the field of psychology, for the longest time, our research thought that children in the same family were somehow equivalent and could be evaluated equivalently in terms of how they relate. And we know children can have very different experiences in a family. They're not coming from the same place. There's not one relationship, right? I'm in a relationship with you, It's very different than someone being in a relationship with me. So in my marriage, I was married to a man who was older than me, right? So those are some variables. He was married to, a queer woman who was younger than him. And so how is that the same relation? Like, how is that and so like we don't have, and this is where the words are starting to get limited too, the perspectives and the fact that there are two realities here to be understood is really not embedded in our language, and it's not automatically there.
Right.
Marshall Rosenberg talks about, he does nonviolent communication work, English anyway. I'm not sure if this stands true for other languages, but it's like the language of kings, where its main aim, it was formed to figure out who should we praise and make and give knighthood to versus who should we punish and throw in the dungeon, right? And that usually there's one perspective, right? And which one's right and which one's wrong, instead of having a multiverse here.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. I don't know if it's related or unrelated. It always feels unrelated in my mind, so I'm just going to name that, and then we probably need to wrap up. I think the other thing that comes into play here is so many people have felt different, exiled, wrong, othered, that sense of existential loneliness that you talked about, feeling different. And those wounds come into relationship. I've had it with my husband and my two boys because they like things that I don't. I was just talking with the client, how these wounds continue to show up. And then if my lens is I don't fit in, I don't belong, because that's been my experience. And when it looks like that's happening again, I can either fall into that narrative and create separation, or I can say, I'm not feeling a part of, and this is what I need to get that sense of security. So those are other factors that just can also make it challenging. And it looks like it's one thing, but it's really about these wounds, how they show up.
Yes. Yeah. It's not always about what it looks like it's about.
I know. You and I have talked about creating friendship school. I don't know if it's really going to happen, but I think it's needed. I think people are longing for friendships and connection and wanting to feel seen and heard and have people that can show up in a way that's similar to how they show up, fulfilling, feeling safe.
Yeah. I think there's definitely some demystification that can be done there, right?
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to say before we wrap up, Jen?
Oh, there's always so much to say, Patricia. I enjoyed this today. I said at the beginning, maybe this would be one that wouldn't make it, but I think this one will make it.
Booyah. I was thinking as we were recording, nailed it. Not going to throw this one out. Booyah.
Oh my gosh, that's so funny.
So I think that's all we've got for today.
Okay. Love you dearly, my friend.
Love you too, Jen. Bye.
Bye.
Hey again. So was that relatable? What else do you want to hear about with friendships and relationships? I think this is something that's a main theme that comes up in the HSP online courses and in therapy, that I think we have such a strong need for connection and wanting to feel seen and heard and wanting to have that sense of reciprocity in relationships. And sometimes we have it, and sometimes it's problematic. And sometimes the people that we're in relationships with don't have the skills to meet us where we're at. But because we haven't experienced healthy relationships, we don't always know that. I don't know, this stuff can be really difficult. And Brene Brown says we're wired for connection. And I believe that. We need to have downtime. We don't need to be connected all the time. But years ago, we had villages and communities, and we all worked together, and our society has gotten pretty isolated. I think COVID has really changed that. Working from home has changed that. So where are you at in your relationships? Are they working for you? Do you feel satisfied? Do you have people that get you and understand you? Where does your wounding show up? Oh, these are just things to think about. If you're interested in working with either Jen or me, we both have some room right now. You can reach Jen at heartfulnessconsulting.com. You can reach me at unapologeticallysensitive.com. The next online HSP course is going to be coming up in February. It's going to run from February 6th through April 17th, 2023. Registration will open on January 11th and go through January 25th. There'll be more information on my website at unapologeticallysensitive.com. You can go to the HSP groups page. This is really a great opportunity to be in community with other people that are wired like you. They're not all the same. We all show up differently, but the vulnerability and the sharing and the sense of being able to see traits that you have in yourself and other people. And I've had people say, my therapist kept telling me all this stuff, but my therapist, it's not that you don't believe your therapist or your coach, but to have other people sharing the same things can be so incredibly validating and healing. It's a great place to meet other people. Some of the groups continue to meet after the 10 weeks are up. Not all of them. I can't always guarantee what happens. But if you're looking for that sense of community connection, you're seeing that you want more than you have, there's some blind spots, please get some support, whether it's from me, Jen, or someone else, or the HSP groups. I want you to have those nurturing, thriving connections that just feel really yummy, that you have a soft place to land and you have someone who gets you and is really on your side and wants the best for you. Who doesn't want that? Anyways, I think that's all I have. I hope you are doing well as we come screaming into the end of 2022. I'm ready for something different for 2023. It's been a good year. I'm just ready for something different. I hope you're doing well. Remember, sensitivity is nothing to apologize for. It's your superpower. Have a blessed day.